Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Law Student Scholarship Panel. My name is Alyssa Sander, and I'm the Animal Law Program Fellow at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. This session will feature 3 authors chosen to present their papers on the animal industrial complex. Now, I would like to introduce our panelists. First, Bailey Frank. Bailey became interested in animal rights during her undergraduate years at Georgetown University, where she helped create the student group Animalia, Animal Rights at Georgetown, and interned with the Humane Society Legislative Fund. After graduating college, she spent 2 years teaching math in the Mississippi Delta, but she ultimately came to realize her heart belonged to the animal rights movement. She enrolled in Duke Law School to pursue a career in animal rights as an animal rights attorney, and currently serves as the president of Duke's Animal Legal Defense Fund student chapter. Next, we have Ryan Smith. Ryan graduated from Columbia University in 2016 with a degree in French, and then joined the Peace Corps, where he spent 2 years teaching English and working on HIV mitigation in Southern Africa. He is currently a third-year student at the University of Alabama School of Law, where he is founder and president of Alabama's Law School's Student Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter. He is currently a legal intern at Animal Outlook and previously interned with the Animal Welfare Institute. Apart from his animal law work, he has worked to secure the release of ICE detainees and has clerked with a disabilities advocacy organization working to challenge Medicaid denials for people with intellectual disabilities. He plans to devote his legal career to advocating for non-human animals. You will also see a presentation from Jessica Chilepi, who is unable to join us live today. Jessica is currently a 3L at Queensland University of Technology in Australia, and her primary professional interest lies in the protection of animal welfare and international law. She has worked on legal research projects for the Global Animal Law Association and the World Federation for Animals, and is a member of Animals Australia and the Animal Ethics Committee at Griffith University. She ultimately aspires to be a leading advocate for animal interests on the international stage and will continue working to better protect non-human animals through the development of effective national and international legislation. Now we will begin with the presentations.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jess, and today I'll be presenting the central points of a paper that I wrote earlier this year entitled "A Fair Go for Animals: How Australian Law Can Better Protect Animals Used in Our Agricultural Industry." Thanks so much first to the ALDF for inviting me to take part in this panel. I hope you all find the session today to be elucidating and engaging. For a brief background on how I came to writing this piece, I have recently completed a Juris Doctor in Australia and have simultaneously been working on a few projects with different animal welfare organisations, including the RSPCA, the World Federation for Animals, and an Animal Ethics Committee at Griffith University. My experiences in these roles has inspired me to dig deeper into some of the ethical questions that I've faced in my work, and has inspired me to synthesize some of these thoughts into the piece that I'll be presenting today. So without further ado, I'll jump into my presentation. I'll begin briefly by explaining the context and intent of the essay, and then I'll move into presenting the key points of 3 main sections, that being the historical background, public versus political views, and areas for improvement. Images of free-roaming cattle and the bushmen are cultural images that have helped define modern Australia. The narrative is recalled in classrooms throughout the nation, bolstering the idea of a free land for the musterer and his cattle. And this is a story Australians have learnt from childhood on the natural conditions of our farm animals. It's no wonder that many shirk from news of the modern realities these animals actually face. In the first 3 months of this year, 1.4 million cattle, 1.2 million sheep, 4.6 million lambs, 1.4 million pigs, and 170 million chickens were slaughtered for meat production in Australia. According to Animals Australia, most of these animals were killed without effective independent oversight. Before slaughter, they're raised in factory farming conditions, otherwise termed concentrated animal feeding operations. This typically involves raising livestock in densely populated environments, such as raising cows in feedlots, hens in cages stacked on top of one another, and pregnant pigs in gestation crates so small that they cannot turn around. And these realities appear contradictive. How can a nation so proud of the ideas of freedom inherent in the outback narratives allow the state of factory farming in Australia today? The intent of this piece is to provide a broad contextual overview of how the Australian legal system deals with the issue. I've provided 3 areas of improvement, but note that these should be explored and addressed more in future research and exploration. I've included recommended reading on each area for your reference. The first colonial animal protection legislation, the Act for the Better Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, was passed in Van Diemen's Land in Tasmania in 1837. The Act emulated the scope of protection afforded by the seminal UK Martins Act, which aimed to prevent the cruel and improper treatment of cattle. However, such interest in protecting farm animals was not necessarily reflective of all public opinion at the time. The Act was perceived particularly by rural Australians as mere urban meddling, leading to an increasingly reinforced trend of providing a broad range of exemptions for cases of ill treatment. Now affected through state and territory codes of practice, which I'll expand more upon later, farm animals are largely excluded from anti-cruelty protection. The ongoing effect of this mentality has been to preserve a double standard in our laws where farm animals are given much less protection than other animals not used for industrialised food production. Today, only 1 of 8 Australian states and territories, that being Victoria, has passed a specific act to regulate the treatment of farm animals. When farm animals are referred to in other general animal welfare laws, they're disconnected from a mode of labelling and referred simply to as stock. Such commodification shines light on the sort of perceptions held about Australian farm animals in our laws, which goes as far as appreciating their value in economic terms and falls short of respecting their individual lives. This section will briefly address the views of the modern Australian public and the positions taken by many politicians and how the incongruity between these affects the potential for reform. There's a crucial gap between what most Australians believe current legislation should achieve for farm animals and the actual protections afforded. According to Future Eye, 95% of Australians view farm animal welfare as a concern, and 91% want some reform to address this. While listeners should note that respondents may be giving what they believe to be more socially acceptable answers, it appears that the majority of Australians from this research are concerned about the suffering of farm animals. However, recent protests by animal welfare activists against factory farming conditions were labelled as, quote, un-Australian by our Prime Minister, signifying in part the institutional bias against those who advocate for improved animal welfare. There's a clear need for our political leaders to appreciate the great number of Australians who believe that protection should be improved for those sentient beings currently being kept in factory farms. Alongside the lack of political response to increasing concerns, there's a significant lack of transparency on the conditions of factory farming. Of the 5 freedoms endorsed by the World Organization for Animal Health, Stephen White points out that Australian factory farming may breach 4 out of 5 of these freedoms. While more of our population are concerned about animal welfare, the details of the extent of suffering are not widely publicised. Instead of raising attention to this issue, there's been attempts to redirect focus to the imagined dangers posed by competing industries, namely plant-based meat alternatives. Senators have recently commenced an inquiry to investigate the labelling of non-animal proteins as misleading. Countering this, Australia's competition regulator, the ACCC, has submitted to the inquiry that it had never found evidence of misleading claims by alternative meat products and that plant-based meat was unlikely to mislead an ordinary consumer. Accordingly, if there is real political concern about confusing the public, it would seem more logical to devote time and energy into education about where consumers' meat actually comes from, rather than attacking the competitors of a protected industry. The final political factor to address here is a common narrative presented in support of the meat industry, that Australia's economy is reliant on its success. Part of this narrative attempts to reframe the reality of meat production as tied to small Australian farms representing the backbone of our economy. In reality, the Productivity Commission has pointed to clear trends towards concentration, so larger farming companies, and intensification, more intensive production techniques. In purely economic terms, this is not surprising given that the growing global population indicates trends for higher consumption of meat and dairy products. Australia is a major exporter of meat, producing 4% of global beef and is responsible for about 16% of world trade in beef. However, with rising animal welfare concerns, there's also indication of increasing growth opportunities for direct competitors, like plant-based meat product producers. So while there's a level of validity to claims that our meat industry benefits the Australian economy currently, the rise of consumer awareness, which is already occurring to some extent, about the realities of this industry and their subsequent preference for meat alternatives will pose an increasing threat to the industry's economic viability, especially as alternatives become more and more economically competitive. So given that the status of factory farming is unsustainable and increasingly unpopular, what legal improvements can be made to better protect our farm animals? First, I suggest redefining the term unnecessary suffering. Animal welfare acts in all Australian states and territories employ welfare words, and these words qualify protections to the extent that the suffering is not unnecessary, unjustifiable, or unreasonable. In a recent case to define the term, Magistrate Crawford, citing Chief Justice Coleridge, asserted that the beneficial or useful end sought to be attained must reasonably be proportionate to the extent of suffering caused. Acts which may be perceived as overt cruelty may therefore be excused if the purpose for which the act is done is to make the animal more serviceable for the use of man. I suggest that definitions of what constitutes unnecessary suffering be more in line with the 10 capabilities approach, which extends consideration beyond economic value. Nussbaum's approach holds that these capabilities should be protected by political structures to ensure that individuals can lead flourishing lives and allows for different interpretation of the capabilities based on species. It focuses on an individual entity's value for their own sake. Integrating a detailed moral individualism approach to the definition of unnecessary suffering would expand the available factors for courts to consider beyond abstract concepts which have historically been interpreted in highly anthropocentric terms. Second, I suggest the development of a National Animal Welfare Department. Currently, there's no such department in Australia that is in charge of developing standards for welfare, nor in administering and reviewing laws relating to farm animals specifically. Creating a department solely dedicated to improving animal welfare could address three major issues. First, the conflict of interest inherent in the Federal Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment being in charge of matters like trade and international agreements relating to animals and in coordinating the Australian animal welfare standards and guidelines. As Deborah Chow puts it, this is because, quote, the bodies charged with developing such standards have been plagued by the conflicting goals of pursuing profitability for Australian agribusinesses and delivering meaningful animal welfare outcomes. This has led to animal standards based on selective science in pursuit of economic goals. While the Australian Constitution leaves legislative responsibility for animal welfare to state and territory departments, the Federal Department of Agriculture is in charge of the standards and guidelines, or otherwise known as the Model Codes of Practice, which are then implemented at the state and territory level. These model codes provide a wide range of defences and exemptions in cases of alleged cruelty in nearly all Australian states and territories, Tasmania being excepted. An independent federal department could better ensure that animal welfare needs are actually prioritised in further development of the welfare codes. Second, it's currently unclear if developed standards are being effectively implemented. For example, while a national information standard governing free-range egg production came into place in 2017, it's uncertain whether these standards are actually being adhered to. A federal body could help direct new national standards of what free-range constitutes for a wider range of farm animals and assist in implementing the standards once developed. Third, the state and territory enforcement systems are currently under structural and financial pressures. In Australia, animal welfare legislation is enforced at the state and territory level, with jurisdictions placing primary responsibility either on a relevant state department or a branch of the privately funded charity, the RSPCA. In the states and territories that rely heavily on the RSPCA for enforcement, two subsequent problems arise. First, relying on a private charity to ensure enforcement is unstable. The RSPCA is dependent almost entirely on donations to function. For instance, in 2019, of the $53.5 million spent by RSPCA New South Wales on operational costs, only $1 million was provided by the state government. The second problem is the demarcation of time and resources within the RSPCA, who has a major responsibility in other areas of animal cruelty as well, for example, pets. Historically, only 9% of RSPCA prosecutions were for cruelty against farm animals. As the Animal Defenders Office, which is a national non-profit community legal centre, has expressed, it's unreasonable to expect a privately funded charity to be able to monitor compliance with our animal welfare laws adequately. A national animal welfare department, while constitutionally limited in its legislative power on animal welfare matters, could nonetheless develop coordinated recommendations for improving enforcement structures at the state and territory level. They would serve as a clear point of assistance and a guide for best practice so that the current work of the RSPCA or the relevant state department or police is better supported in enforcement matters. Finally, animal cruelty cases that do make it to court can face the hurdle of gaining standing and, if granted, the disappointment of weak sentencing. I will first address the difficulties of third parties being granted standing to represent non-human animals in court, and then address the leniency of sentencing in criminal prosecution of animal cruelty. It appears that unless an animal organisation is explicitly recognised by the Australian government as having special status, their chances of gaining standing as a third party in restraining a breach of welfare legislation is limited. As Justice Gibbs put it in the case of Australian Conservation Foundation, an interest for the present purposes does not mean a mere intellectual or emotional concern. Accordingly, in the case of animal liberation and the Department of Environment and Conservation, the court refused to grant an injunction sought by animal liberation to restrain aerial shooting of pigs and goats on a New South Wales nature reserve, as animal liberation did not have the necessary special interest. However, in another case, Animal Angels and the Department of Agriculture, the court found that Animal Angels did have standing because the relevant government department had recognised the appellant's particular status in the area of live animal export. As most animal welfare organisations lack clear government recognition of their status in matters related to farm animal welfare, advocacy of these animals' interests is very rare. I recommend that as farm animals lack the capacity to legally represent themselves, the traditional rules of standing should be expanded in these matters to allow well-established animal welfare organisations to represent them. If criminal prosecution of cruelty is successful, the penalties imposed in sentencing have typically been very lenient. While the penalties listed for animal cruelty offences in state and territory acts are seemingly harsh, a judicial cycle of leniency has historically been the norm. Currently, fines, considered the least severe option, are the most common penalty imposed, while imprisonment is the least common. I recommend that courts increase the penalties imposed in animal cruelty cases to better reflect the severity of mistreating the non-human animals under human care. It seems clear that more and more Australians are in support of improving the treatment of farm animals. I believe that improved education and transparency on the conditions of factory farming can result in further consumer preferences for meat alternatives and a larger majority that supports improved protection and enforcement standards. I've presented three broad areas for improvement. First, an updated conception of unnecessary suffering, which applies consideration of the 10 capabilities. Second, better coordination of standards and assistance to state and territory departments and other enforcement organisations through a national animal welfare department. And third, more opportunities for animal organisations to defend non-human animals in court with harsher penalties imposed. It's my hope that pursuing initiatives like these will lead Australia away from further entrenching cruelty and towards a freer life for farm animals. That concludes my presentation today. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at the address provided in the slides.
Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation at the 5th Annual Student Convention for the Animal Legal Defense Fund. I'm honored and thrilled and excited to be here to present on this topic that I've been working on for about a year. There is a note version of this topic coming out, being published in the Lewis and Clark Animal Law Review in the fall. So if this presentation piques your interest and you want to learn more, please look out for that. It should be coming out, I think, in November or December of 2021. There will be also a 50-state survey in that note that includes all of the state regulations regarding the topic that we're discussing today. So I'm going to be focusing more specifically on federal regulations, but in the question and answer session, I'm happy to answer more state-specific questions. So the title of my presentation is Not for Human Consumption, Cruelty Plaguing the Pet Food Industry. This presentation is going to proceed in 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about what is happening. So why is animal cruelty in the pet food industry so much worse and more severe than it is in other industries that use animals for food? We're going to talk about why it's happening. So what specifically about the regulations and the industry allow such cruelty to take place? And then we're going to talk about how we could fix it. I have a couple proposed solutions. This is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just my essential musings on ways that we could potentially address this problem in the short term and in the long term. So jumping right in, when we talk about pet food production, it's important to have a clear idea of what we're talking about. Some of you may remember this image from the Netflix series Tiger King. This is from episode 2. And for those of you who were fortunate enough to have never watched Tiger King, this is a dump truck full of expired Walmart meat. This is the meat that they would feed to their exotic animals that they kept in captivity and feed to each other. So they would also take meat from these trucks and eat it themselves. So when I say pet food, this is not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about meat that was sold for humans at Walmart and then eventually given to animals, non-human animals. But what we will learn through the course of this presentation is that, ironically, the quality of the expired Walmart meat is probably better and more humane than the pet food we are currently feeding animals, both in domestic animals and wild animals. So when I say pet food, I'm referring to any products made for dogs, cats, or exotic animals that is not intended for human consumption. So up here, you will see a chart of the US total pet food animal-based ingredients over the course of a 12-month period from March 2019 to March of 2020. This lays out for you in tons, notably, the different types of parts of animals that are used in pet food, byproducts. When they say meal, that typically means a mixture of different kinds of things. You'll notice they have animal fat and then poultry fat. Chickens are generally considered to be a different kind of animal for purposes of analysis. And you will also notice that if you go to the right column at the bottom, the total value of animal-based ingredients is over $4.6 billion. So what this means is there is an industry using $4.6 billion worth of animal parts that is, as you will see, largely unregulated. So in addition to the various body parts that are contained in pet food, we also have drugs, disease, and death. So for drugs, euthanasia drugs are repeatedly found by the FDA in commercial pet foods. Now, under FDA regulations, pet food is usually considered adulterated, so not fit for sale or consumption, if it's contaminated with pentobarbital. Now I say usually because there is a trace amount that can be permitted because it does not lead to immediate sickness on the part of the animals who consume it. And notably, consumers who are trying to ensure that their pets are not eating pentobarbital may also have a hard time proving or essentially like getting their rights to clean and healthy pet food established by the courts, because the rule for liability for pet food is incredibly difficult to meet. So in a recent case called Weaver versus Champion Pet Foods, a court found that the risk of contamination of an animal is not sufficient. So in that case, the facts of that case were a man had bought pet food for his dog, and the sample of the essentially shipment of pet food tested positive for pentobarbital. Now, his animal did not get sick. So even though we had evidence that the pet food where he purchased his pet food, so the larger sample had tested positive for pentobarbital, because his animal was not sick, he did not have standing to bring the case. So what that means is, unless your animal gets sick from euthanasia drugs, which are incredibly dangerous to animals, and you will see here they can cause drowsiness, dizziness, loss of balance, inability to stand, or coma and death, you won't have standing to bring a case. So testing for pentobarbital can also be prohibitive. It's often difficult to find a lab that will test for those kinds of things. And it is known scientifically to survive the rendering process. So if an animal is euthanized with pentobarbital, it will end up in the final product. And we also want to talk about who is in pet food. So what animals exactly are being killed in this industry that make it different from other industries? So this is a screenshot from a website that sells exotic pet food and domestic animal pet food as well. They sell dog and cat food for raw diets, but this is their exotic animal page. And you will see there that 99.9% horse meat with trace minerals is easily available on their site. They have combined horse meat and beef with trace minerals, and you can buy this raw meat online and they will ship anywhere. This particular website is from Bravo Packing, which is located in Carneys Point, New Jersey. Now, Bravo Packing has been cited by the FDA for multiple violations of what they call the CGM practices, or consumer good management practices, I believe. But there was also an undercover investigation of their facility and an overall investigation and complaint filed by Animal Outlook, which you can see there. I have a link on my slide if you're interested in learning more about that particular facility. I do not have any pictures, graphic images of what takes place in that facility, but it is truly horrendous. So I would recommend that you look into that and encourage people not to buy raw meat diets from this particular location. In addition to who is in pet food, we also have what are called by the industry 3D or 4D animals, depending on the context. So the D stands for dead, dying, diseased. The 4D will also sometimes include disabled. Now, these animals are those that have been rejected for sale for human consumption by the USDA. So there is a statute that says you are not allowed to slaughter and sell for human consumption animals that have, upon arriving at the facility, found to be diseased, dying, dead, or disabled. So you might hear the term like downed cows or downed pigs. In those cases, they're not supposed to be slaughtering those animals for human consumption. However, they can slaughter them for pet food. So states to varying degrees specifically permit this. So California explicitly notes in their state law that animals deemed unfit for human consumption due to illness or injury may be used in pet foods. No states prohibit this, and it is a very common practice to sell the downed animals or the 4D or 3D animals to rendering facilities for pet food. If we look now at the regulation surrounding this industry, animals used in the production of food are usually overseen by the USDA. So if you have a slaughterhouse facility, a CAFO, a farm that is producing food for human consumption, the USDA is going to be involved in the regulation, and the FDA will only be involved in the product, the final product. So assessing the safety of the final product and dealing with labeling and things like that. For pet food, however, the federal regulation is limited to FDA oversight under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So the FDA's primary mission is consumer safety and public health. Now, why is this a problem? Well, the problem is that the USDA is the enforcement agency for the Humane Methods of Livestock Slaughter Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Now, on a federal level, animal welfare oversight is already very limited in the food industry, but even the very minimal protections that we offer to certain animals is not available in the pet food industry. Because under the Federal Meat Inspection Act, it states that inspection shall not be provided at any establishment in which the following animals, mules, equines, cattle, sheep, are not intended for use as human food. Now, there is a way that you can pay to have the USDA come and audit your facility under the statute, but the FDA recently sent out a notice of proposed rulemaking seeking to get rid of this exemption and this offer essentially to have additional oversight by the USDA because it has never been used, shockingly. No one has ever paid for more regulatory oversight by the USDA, so they are seeking to get rid of this exemption entirely. So another issue with this is you have a lot of great legislation that is proposed by often bipartisan legislators. The most recent SAFE Act was introduced in the Senate. It's Senate Bill 2732, and it's sponsored by Lindsey Graham, and we have a lot of overlap often in animal welfare considerations. And on the screen, you will see from a previous version of the SAFE Act, which is a Safeguard American Food Exports Act. The Humane Society put together this great infographic that states, this bill would prevent horse slaughter plants from opening in the US and end the current expansion of shipping horses abroad for slaughter for human consumption. And if you go on Reddit, you will see a lot of people who are very convinced that, no, horses are not slaughtered in the US. You have a lot of Reddit legal experts who are telling you that you can't slaughter horses in the US. We have federal legislation seeking to prevent this, and they're only half right. Because as you may remember, horse meat is readily available on the website. In fact, New Jersey is a state that has passed a law banning horse slaughter, but it's for human consumption, which means that even at the federal level, the most progressive legislation that seeks to ban slaughter of a particular animal because of welfare considerations does not apply in the pet food industry. So what can be done to address some of the cruelty in the production of pet food? Well, first, I would propose eliminating the Federal Meat Inspection Act exemption, and instead of offering USDA inspection, I would require USDA inspection and enforcement of the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. So rather than revoke this optional inspection as they're seeking to do, we should make it necessary. I would also eliminate qualifiers like for human consumption when regulating slaughter. So my reasoning is the destination of the animal is irrelevant when you're talking about animal welfare. If the goal of the Humane Slaughter Act is to make slaughter humane, it shouldn't matter that a cow or a pig is destined for pet food or human food. It's not about where they end up. It's about where they are when they are being slaughtered and how they are being slaughtered. If we really care about the welfare of animals like horses, we shouldn't permit their slaughter for pet food any more than we should for human consumption. And the last thing I would recommend is educating consumers and encouraging transparency. So don't say that there's no more horse slaughter in the US or this act is going to end horse slaughter, because it's not. It's going to end it for human consumption, but Americans don't really eat horse meat anyway. The way that horses are used in the US is in pet food and for exotic animal meat diets. So to the first proposed solution that I have in eliminating the exemption, the reasons why this would be relatively easy is there's already clear agency division. So essentially, I would be proposing that the regulation that exists for human consumption would exist for non-human consumption. The USDA infrastructure already exists. A lot of the facilities that are regulated by the USDA also provide the animals for rendering facilities for pet food. They just keep the animals separate. So instead of doing that, they just monitor them all at the same time. And the legislative purpose, the stated legislative purpose behind the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act is designed to ensure that animals raised for food be spared needless suffering. So this would be in line both with the stated policy of the Act and the existing infrastructure. To eliminating qualifiers like for human consumption, this would ensure that animal welfare legislation benefits all the animals that should be covered. So we already struggle with having exemptions to laws like the Animal Welfare Act. I mean, chickens aren't covered, lab animals often aren't covered. We don't need additional exemptions to animals that are supposed to be covered simply because they're being put in pet food. And we need to end consumer confusion. If we get rid of qualifiers like for human consumptions, then statements like this act will ban horse slaughter is accurate. And a voter who is calling their representative saying, yes, please support this act, isn't secretly having a horse slaughtered, in their backyard because the facility behind them renders pet food, right? There's no misunderstanding in terms of what is actually being accomplished with the legislation, and no new agencies need to be created. My final recommendation is to educate consumers and encourage transparency. Now, this may actually be the most important because at the end of the day, no federal or state regulatory agency is acting in the best interests of the animals being slaughtered. We know as largely animal rights activists and animal advocates that consumer demand and consumer awareness is incredibly important in making change in this industry. So what we need are alternatives. Now, I am not a veterinarian. I don't pretend to have a degree in nutritional science. And so any changes to a pet's diet should absolutely be made in consultation with a veterinarian. But I will say that my cat, Dee Dee, has been a plant-based pet for 4 years, and she is absolutely thriving. And my dog, Pomegranate, has been a plant-based pet for 1.5 years, and she also has never been healthier. I get their blood checked every single year at the vet. The vet always says that they're doing great. And the awesome thing is that there are so many options now for plant-based pet food. 100% of dogs generally can be plant-based in studies, and up to 97% of cats have found to thrive on a plant-based diet as well. My particular website that I like to find studies and information about this is Vecado, VECADO. If you type that into Google, it's a Canadian website if you want to learn more. At the end of the day, no matter what pet food you consider to be ideal for your pet food contaminated with pentobarbital or created from the body parts of sick and injured animals simply cannot be the best answer. So in sum, eliminating unnecessary cruelty for millions of animals every year for the low cost of 3 words for human consumption seems a reasonable price, and one that animal advocates and general consumers alike should be willing to pay. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please follow me on the socials, which are listed there. I love to connect with fellow animal law students and animal law activists on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And if you enjoyed this presentation, please look out for my student note, which will also be entitled Not for Human Consumption in the upcoming Lewis and Clark Animal Law Review.
Hi everyone, my name is Ryan Smith and I'm a third-year law student at the University of Alabama School of Law. And the paper I'm going to present on today is Using Interest Convergence to Win Animal Rights. So as a preliminary matter, I'm going to discuss what interest convergence is. Interest convergence is the theory that the majority will only support the interests of the minority if their interests align. And this is one of the key ideas of critical race theory. It was first written about by Derek Bell. He created it. He's one of the founders of critical race theory, and that was in a law review article in Harvard Law Review in 1980. Now, there's going to be 2 years that are relevant to the discussion about interest convergence here. One is 1954, which is when the Brown v. Board of Education decision was handed down. And the other is 1947, which is when the Cold War started. So Bell discovered that in 1954, when Brown v. Board of Education was decided, America in the midst of the Cold War was desperately trying to garner support to prevent the spread of communism abroad. Now, domestically, there was and still is a race problem in the United States that made it difficult to claim moral superiority abroad. And definitely the Soviet Union and others took advantage of this opportunity to essentially say that America was a bad place to live and therefore that communism was the better solution. So there was essentially an American foreign policy to try to improve the United States' stature abroad. So here we have the white majority, their interest in preventing the spread of communism that aligned with the interest of the non-white minority to desegregate. And Bell stipulated that that resulted in a decision by the Board of Education. A piece of evidence about that that's pretty telling is the Department of Justice filed an amicus brief for that decision that stated that desegregation was in the national interest in part because of foreign policy. I'm going to read a short quote from that brief. DOJ wrote, "The United States is trying to prove to the people of the world of every nationality, race, and color that a free democracy is the most civilized and most secure form of government yet devised by man." And so Brown came down, and the newspapers also took notice. And after that decision, the newspapers hailed it as a blow to communism. Now, Bell says that without this convergence of interests, Brown would not have occurred, particularly not at that time, and desegregation might still be a struggle we were dealing with today. However, it did come down, and as you can imagine, if these two interests converge, then it's also possible that they might later diverge. And this is exactly what happened, at least in part, with the Brown decision and desegregation more broadly. In the years following, there was a slowing of progress to a level that was deemed acceptable by the white majority, including forced integration regardless of actual impact on any particular community, and a gradual abandonment of the principles of the decision as schools have gradually resegregated in recent decades. But now some of you might be asking how this idea has anything to do with animal rights. So the idea that Bell wrote about interest convergence more broadly is a descriptive theory. It attempts to describe what actually happened historically. And what I'm talking about here is a different use. It's a prescriptive use of interest convergence. And we all know about this kind of use already. A lot of this is going to be a review for us. So we're going to go over a few different ones of those: health, environmentalism, and disease vectors, both from a historical, present, and future-looking perspective. And before that, we're going to talk quickly about the utilitarian arguments for respecting animals based on ethical considerations. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to use these converging interests to help people transition from animal exploitation to animal ethics, essentially, through changing habits, and then transitioning finally to an ethical basis for that consideration, which avoids some of the problems of future diverging interests. So we're going to start off with a quick discussion of utilitarianism. So Jeremy Bentham is widely considered the founder of utilitarianism, and one of his key contributions was that he established suffering as the criterion which matters in terms of whether a particular action is considered ethical from a utilitarian standpoint. Much later, in the 70s, we had Peter Singer, another utilitarian philosopher, write Animal Liberation. That book was immensely successful and had a great impact on the animal rights movement. However, neither of these authors were able to achieve the kind of changes that they wanted to achieve. Peter Singer recently has discussed how he is a little bit disappointed that the book, Animal Liberation, and the other work that he's done in the animal rights realm has not been more impactful. So transitioning now to the actual interest convergences that are causing people to be more considerate of animal issues. We're first going to look at health, human health. So there have been, throughout history, many different small groups that have cared about vegetarianism for health reasons, but it really took the counterculture of the 60s and 70s for the rise of healthy vegetarianism to take hold. A key work in this time period was Francis Moore Lapé's Diet for a Small Planet, which was published in 1971. And in that book, Lapé discussed animal ethics, the environment, and health. And books in the following decade, in the 1980s, transitioned to more purely discussing the health trends and health impact of a vegetarian diet. And we can see this continued popularity today. We have research showing the detrimental effects of meat consumption, the increased availability of plant-based alternatives, even rising in places down here like Alabama, and the cultural equation of vegan and vegetarian with healthy, which we all know is not entirely true. Now we're going to turn to a different interest convergence, which is environmentalism. So environmentalism is a little bit different than health in that this doesn't inherently converge with animal issues. For example, President Roosevelt was a well-known conservationist and also a well-known big game hunter. The early connection between animal ag and environmental issues, Lapé's book was another key driver in that, where she discussed the concern for the resources used to make meat, the massive amounts of water, grain, etc., and the waste that was produced. And the direct pollution of factory farms has been a continuing issue, whether that be pollution of air, water, and usually into the direct communities where usually disadvantaged communities are further disadvantaged by environmental harm. And on a broader scale, looking to the present and the future, we have the climate change impact of animal agriculture. There's estimates range from 14% to about 50%, depending on the overall scope of what people are looking at. But regardless, the animal agriculture industry is contributing massively to the climate change problem. And there are efforts to reduce the impact of animal agriculture on climate change and environmental impact more generally. A couple of these are through cultured meat, which is cutting-edge technology where meat is able to be grown outside of an animal. And there's also gas capture, which is also relatively novel and relatively ineffective at this point, where gases that would otherwise go into the atmosphere are captured. And now I want you to remember both of those because we're going to be returning to those ideas a little bit later on. Now, moving to the third convergent interest here, we have zoonotic disease. Now, zoonotic disease is any disease that began in a non-human animal and was then transmitted to humans. And these have been with us forever. Where zoonotic diseases are rabies, malaria, plague, HIV. The CDC estimates that a full 60% of all infectious diseases are zoonotic in origin. And the conditions of animal agriculture make human to animal transmission very likely. And we can look to some recent examples of that, such as the 2009 swine flu outbreak, the bird flu outbreaks in 2014, 16, and 17, the SARS outbreak in 2003, and the MERS in 2014. Now, those last two, SARS and MERS, were both coronaviruses. And as we all know, the world has been a little bit preoccupied with a different coronavirus, COVID-19, and the origins are a little bit debated about where COVID came from, but it does seem extremely likely that COVID is also zoonotic in origin. However, it essentially is irrelevant because as soon as it as soon as it was introduced to the human population, it spread rapidly in factory farms. Thousands and thousands of workers were infected, a bunch of lawsuits have come after that, and it's been just a horrible situation all around. Now, COVID was horrible, it's caused a lot of death and destruction worldwide. It is also important to recognize that COVID could have been a lot worse, either in terms of transmissibility or fatality rate. And scientists say that it's really just a matter of time until something comes along that is going to be worse. And transitioning from animal agriculture, especially factory farming, is therefore vital in order to mitigate this risk. Now, as we've gone over these few different ways of interest convergence in terms of how people can essentially be convinced to transition away from animal agriculture and animal exploitation more broadly. The real issue here is that we want to avoid the pitfalls that befell essentially the desegregation efforts of Brown and interest convergence more broadly when those interests diverge. So essentially, the first step here is to change habits by whatever means necessary, and that's the main prescriptive use of these interest convergences. And we want to avoid the pitfalls by essentially having that first step act as a way to break a habit. And as soon as people change their habits, then they become more open to the ideas that are more durable, namely the ethical considerations behind animal rights. So in the short term, any avoidance of animal exploitation should be celebrated. However, after society steps away from animal consumption and breaks the habit of viewing animals as tools for food, that essentially allows the flood of reasons for affording animals the rights they're due to rush in. And far from being a cheap way to win points for animals, these converging interests are the ways to a better future for humans and animals alike, and are the path to the world envisioned by those whose goal is respect for all sentient beings. Thank you so much for your time and the opportunity to share this with you.
It helps if you unmute yourself. Okay, thank you so much, both of you, for your presentations, and we will go ahead and jump into Q&A now. My first question is for Bailey. Could you describe some of the trends you identified in your 50-state survey of state regulations concerning pet food that you had mentioned at the beginning of your presentation?
Absolutely. So state regulations are typically focused on one of two departments. So pet food rendering facilities will either be overseen by the Department of Health or the Department of Agriculture. And in some cases, like in New Jersey, they go back and forth and back and forth. And so there's not really a clear division of responsibility, even among the states, about who should really be in charge of this, whether it's an agriculture issue or a state-specific issue. And while many states have specific things like California stating that, downed animals and or horses can be slaughtered for pet food, in most cases, it's just a generic nothing. In some cases, some states don't even have anything saying where pet food is supposed to be monitored or what agency is supposed to regulate it. And so the unfortunate reality is in the states that have the most regulation, that's usually entrenching the ability to slaughter in very inhumane ways different kinds of sick and injured animals. And so it kind of, in the inverse of what may usually be the case, is that the states that have nothing, including a state humane slaughter law, may actually the best place to start trying to tackle some of the issues with pet food slaughtering.
Great, thank you. That is, a great point that some of the states that actually don't have anything are some of the easiest to kind of work on. I think that goes with a lot of, animal issues at this point too. Our next question is for Ryan. If interest convergence is a descriptive theory, what makes you think that it could be used in the prescriptive way that you described?
Well, I guess the quick answer to that is that it already has been used in that way. So we've already seen with some of those examples that I gave the ways in which it's has historically and is currently being used to essentially convince people to change their habits. I think that the real takeaway here is to keep this kind of strategy in mind anytime we see something new that can come up and be leveraged in that way. So none of us expected COVID to come along. But when it did, it really became evident that this was a problem that animal agriculture was exacerbating. So if when the next thing comes along, we just want to be proactive and make sure that we know what is going on and how that can be used to change minds.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is for Bailey. What plant-based products do your dog and cat eat? And then a kind of a follow-up to that as well is if they were ever on animal-based products, what was it like for them to transition to the plant-based?
So my cat is on Amicat for dry food and Evolution for wet food. So we do a mixture of those. And my dog, eats Wild Earth, which is a relatively new dog food plant-based brand. And so they're actually based in North Carolina where I'm located. And so I've been able to kind of meet the people behind that. And that's been really exciting. The transition for me was relatively easy because I rescued both my animals at such a relatively young age. They hadn't really adjusted to any particular diet. So the shelter where I adopted my dog from, they would feed them whatever they could get their hands on. So it was animal based, but it wasn't like one particular kind of food or one particular kind of brand. And so the transition was very easy, not only because she loves the Wild Earth dog food, but also because she wasn't really used to a particular diet. And so if you have an older dog who's more familiar with a particular kind of food, it can definitely be a little bit more challenging. But just as with changing any food, you go day by day, you go slowly, you make sure that you're in consult with your veterinarian. If your dog or cat has any health conditions or diseases. I have found that whenever I have dogs over for a play date, they love her plant-based pet food. I've converted several dog parents this way, and they say, oh my God, my dog does not eat dry food and they love your food. And I'm like, I know, it's because it's great. And so the dog food was pretty easy. The cat food, we all know cats can be a little bit more opinionated than dogs when it comes to food. I tried a couple different brands with her. Amicat was the one I settled on that she loved the most. For the wet food, it's kind of hit or miss. Some days she loves it and can't get enough, and some days she can't believe that I would ever deign to feed her something like that. And so it varies. The other thing I found that cats really like for taste, no matter what you're doing, is nutritional yeast. And cats and dogs really like that flavor. And so if you're trying something more plant-based, nutritional yeast is a great way to get them interested in it. And Vocado, the website I mentioned, has so many great brands and options, and they also have great plant-based treats. So instead of starting with, let's say, the meal, you wanted to start with plant-based treats, they have plant-based bones and plant-based peanut butter crackers and all these different kind of supplements as well that are all plant-based. And so that's a great way to start the transition too.
Yes, thank you. I admittedly, my dogs both still eat regular dog food, but for treats, we've started transitioning to plant-based treats, like you mentioned, like peanut butter or pumpkin, because 'tis the season right now. So, and I was a little bit nervous at first to see, I have one very picky dog, but she rubbed herself all over it before eating it, as she does with everything else. So it was very exciting to see that maybe she would be open to that.
And I did want to address just one of the other questions I noticed in there, which I'm sure a lot of people have too, about the obligate carnivore question for cats specifically. So taurine is a necessary ingredient, nutritional, aspect of cat food. The thing that a lot of consumers don't know is that in the rendering process for most pet foods and for meat, a lot of the nutrients are removed, including taurine. So what do the industries do? They supplement it back in. Taurine can be added just like any other supplement, B12, B11, like vitamin A, vitamin C. And so what a lot of plant-based companies figured out, like Wild Earth, was that, well, if they're just adding it back anyway, why don't we just do that with plant food? And so that's what they start doing. So there is taurine in my cat's food, necessarily, and she's doing wonderful on it. And they always meet the AFCO nutritional profiles as well, the ones that are sold on Bacado. Now, there are other issues with that, not the least of which is a lobbying group makes those profiles. But for purposes of assessing comparing any sort of nutritional profiles that might be necessary for a domestic animal, those are very helpful in terms of seeing whether or not it's the same as the food you might be feeding your pet currently.
Great. Thank you so much for clarifying that. I did not know that, so that is really good to know. Our next question is for Ryan. Why is an ethical basis for animal rights a more durable way to create change when welfare improvements can be had there, and many people justify consuming animals on the basis that their buying choices are more ethical?
Okay, yeah, if I understand correctly there, I mean, it's a tough balance there because, of course, we do care about animal welfare as well at the same time. So we want to promote animal ethics as the basis for it, essentially because it's the thing that it's always going to be there as a concern. If we're killing and eating animals for food, then that is the fundamental problem here. And so I guess, like I mentioned in my presentation, there's a couple of solutions to some of these problems, such as gas capture or cultured meat and all that. And everyone's going to have a different line for where they might draw, like if you're doing it for welfare reasons, where you might draw that line to say, okay, this is good enough. But the ultimate question is whether the killing of animals for our purposes is acceptable to begin with. So the idea is to basically use everything we can in order to get people to recognize that the animals in and of themselves are what we should value here, and not necessarily care about the welfare associated with that in the short term. So it's essentially redrawing their line. In order to do that, you have to get people to change their habits in the first place. Otherwise, they just essentially are very resistant to any of those arguments.
Great. Thank you so much. Our next question will be for Bailey again. How can we feed captive wildlife such as tigers who need raw meat without this type of cruelty?
That is an excellent question. And the answer is kind of twofold. One is we need to reduce the number of animals in captivity. So if an animal cannot be rewilded and is forced to reside in captivity, they should be at an accredited sanctuary. So I would not say that zoos, in my opinion, are necessary. So we should work to always reduce the number of animals that we are holding in captivity. But for the animals that because of human conditions, we have either destroyed their habitat or they need to be in a sanctuary to survive, the best solution to this already exists, and it is cultivated meat. Not only is that great environmentally and animal welfare speaking, but one of the most kind of interesting things in looking into this area is that because you can essentially grow any kind of meat in the lab, you can grow meat that is very nutritionally appropriate for whatever animal you're trying to feed. So we mentioned, again, like going back to my cat, she's plant-based, but there is a company currently working on creating rodent growing, not killing, but growing rodent-based cat food, because domestic cats, my 9-pound domestic cat was not meant to be eating a cow or a giant pig. In the wild, cats, like wild feral cats, are not going out and hunting cows and pigs, but that's usually what's being put into their pet food. Or fish. Cats don't like water. I don't know where we got the idea that cats are going to go into a stream and fish out salmon. My cat would never go near water. And so you can do a very species appropriate diet when you're actually cultivating the diet of the animal who needs it. Now, that's not commercially available yet. So in the meantime, the best answer is to make sure you're not sourcing raw meat from places that are, either rendering pet food and that you're making sure it's coming from some facility that's covered by the USDA.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is for Ryan. This person would like to know, have you seen any negative effects of interest convergence in the environmental and humanitarian spheres? And if so, how could those be fixed, I suppose?
Thank you for the question. Well, I'm not an expert on the convergence of the interests between the humanitarian and environmental spheres. It's definitely clear that any interest essentially can be used however someone wants to. So if one interest like environmentalism is the problem, there's many different solutions to that problem. And so some of those solutions might be ultimately detrimental or harmful in some other realm like humanitarianism. Other solutions on that list might be better for the humans involved. And we can see the same thing with environmentalism's impact on animal welfare as well. We say like, okay, well, we can fix this aspect of environmentalism, but it might still have the problem of animals' welfare rights, might have the disease problems still there. So you might be able to fix one thing in many different ways. So you do have to be careful in terms of how you're choosing to actually approach these issues and what solutions you're pushing for. And it does take me back as well to saying that that's why some of these solutions are not durable, that you might solve one thing and it can either be solved and then abandoned because of that. Also, you bring up a good point that saying that once one thing is solved in one particular way, that actually could be harmful if the solution chosen is not a very good one. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. And then our last question is for both of you. Bailey, you can go first, and then Ryan. I would just love to know if either of you have tips or could share your story about how you chose a topic. I know it can be really hard to choose a topic in this area. There's so many, but you don't know what is been talked about too much or not enough. So if you could just share your stories a little bit on that and some tips would be great.
Yeah, so I came up with my topic because I was interning at Animal Outlook and we had a project that we were working on, and we ended up kind of delving a little bit into like pet food regulation, and I kind of realized, that that's a whole other area that I hadn't really considered. And then I went to the ABA Animal Law Committee meeting and I did a presentation on what I had found. And a lot of people, like full-grown attorneys, were shocked that horse slaughter was legal and had been under the impression that you could not slaughter horses in the United States. And that really showed me that, okay, this is something that probably needs to be written about and researched. And so I just found that it generally hadn't been. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to enroll at Duke Law School, where I go, in a scholarly writing class, where I was given the resources and time to dedicate to making this into a real student note for publication.
Yeah, thanks. The way that I would say is a good way to find topics for this kind of writing is look at the restrictions that are already given to you. I like the saying that restrictions breed creativity. So when I'm writing a paper for animal issues, I usually am writing in a realm that has inherently nothing to do with animals. So this paper idea came about when I was in a critical race theory class, and we didn't talk about animals at all for the entire class. But I took this idea and I asked myself, how does this relate to animal issues? Does it relate to animal issues? And usually in any topic I've seen, I can find an in with that. If you're dealing with some class that deals with poverty, you can look at how animal agriculture affects impoverished communities or poor workers. Those are just a couple of examples and things that I've used to essentially act as jumping off points. And ways to really get the gears moving in terms of how do animals fit into this.
Great, thank you so much. And I will just add, don't be afraid to maybe choose a topic that scares you a little bit. I am currently writing, and at first I had chosen a topic that I was a little familiar with, and then found out that that topic had already been taken, and so I needed to figure out a new one. And I chose one that I had completely no background information on at all, and so I was a little bit nervous to kind of dive into that, but it turns out I've learned a ton, and it's been really interesting. So that would be my little tip as well. But thank you for joining us today. It's been really great. I loved watching your presentations.